So good morning, everybody. My name is Fiona Murphy. Well, I was lately of Wiley for about 10 years of publishing, and I've leaped off into the unknown. I'm now semi-independent publishing consultant, so I'm very pleased to be here. And yes, wanted to thank you again for the travel grant. That was really kind. Just to say, we've got 4 really great speakers lined up for the first session for the meeting. I'm aware that we need to keep to time very well, so just to warn them all, I'm going to be sitting here and I'll start waving, and I'll eventually take the microphone away from you if you don't stop when spoken to. If there's time after each talk, then we will take questions. But in the meantime, the first speaker is, I'd like to introduce Jeff Builder over there, who's the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Crossref. He's been disrupting publishing technology for a number of years, but also supporting and educating publishers in how to survive and benefit from those disruptions. And he's going to be talking about a DOI event tracker, a forthcoming initiative.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you so much to AM for inviting me. However, I have to say I'm not so sure of the wisdom of providing everybody with projectiles in their bags. I, for one, am not exactly keen on this new idea, and shall be speaking to the organizers sometime later about how to avoid this. And now I'm going to play a fun game of trying to locate my presentation on this thing. Okay, yep. Oh, wow, Builder, how about that? As Fiona said, my name is Jeffrey Builder, and she sort of gave my embarrassingly grandiose title of Director of Strategic Initiatives. And that doesn't mean much to many people, and so I like to translate that roughly into new stuff. I was hired by Crossref about 7 years ago, about halfway through Crossref's life, after they'd successfully piloted and launched this DOI system for persistently linking citations in the scholarly literature. And at the time, the board was thinking about other initiatives that they might be able to pursue that had similar characteristics, in that they were things that could only really be accomplished if there was cooperation across stakeholders, and particularly across publishers in the industry. And I've been asked here to talk to you about standards in Altmetrics. And for those of you who know me, you'll also know that I have a fairly low tolerance for the process of generating standards. So this is a kind of odd topic for me to talk about. And so as I was pondering what to do and what to say about standards in Altmetrics, I resorted to one of my favorite tricks, which is to go to the dictionary and find out what on earth we're talking about when we're talking about both metrics and standards. And there's something interesting if you look these things up in your handy-dandy Apple dictionary. The metric is a system or standard of measurement. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing. We have the word metric, which is defined with the word standard. And here I am supposed to be talking about standards and metrics. So if you go and look up standard, one of the things that you'll see in definition 2 is something used as a measure, i.e. a metric, norm or model in comparative evaluations. Now, when I see definitions like this, I start thinking that I'm seeing a snake eating itself. What is it that we're doing if we're defining standards for metrics and metrics for the standards? What is it, in fact, that we want to accomplish through this process? As I proceeded looking through my dictionary, I also came up with another definition for standard, and that is a military or ceremonial flag carried on a pole or hoisted on a rope. And to me, this seems like a good departure point, right? Because effectively the Altmetrics movement was sort of hoisting a banner, was hoisting a, we got somebody complaining about audio.
Well, nobody can hear you at home.
At all, yeah, no, I'm quiet that way.
You're walking around too much.
Oh, I see.
I'm ruthless, sorry.
All right. All right. And so this seemed like a good place to depart, right? Because the Altmetrics movement was effectively a shot across the bow. It was a group of people hoisting what was effectively a war flag, criticizing a situation that we existed in the scholarly communication industry, in which we thought that the existing metrics were off target. They were measuring the wrong things. They weren't reflecting the true value of the content that was being produced. They were measuring something else. They were measuring perhaps something having to do with a journal, not an article. And so this was one of the things that people were responding to. The other thing that they were responding to is that this metric that was so widely used in our industry was something that couldn't actually be audited and recalculated by anybody else. A lot of the data that is involved in calculating impact factors and citation metrics isn't available to the vast majority of people. There are a few organizations who have access to it. They can calculate these things, and as we know, some of the numbers, and as we'll hear later, some of the numbers that are calculated from these things can actually differ wildly. And then the third and perhaps strongest motivation was that there was a current concern that so much of the conversation, particularly as content was becoming more open, was occurring outside of the scholarly ecosystem and the traditional modes of scholarly communication. So you had references to the scholarly literature going on as supplemental and gray literature, orthogonal professional literature, scholarly tools, some of the things like Mendeley and the scholarly sharing networks, secondary outlets, disciplinary repositories, mainstream media, and of course the darling of those people who generally talk about altmetrics, social media, things like Twitter and Facebook and so on and so forth. And in other words, the scholarly record, as we knew it, was actually shifting. A lot of the discussions were occurring outside of this sort of ecosystem, this biotope that had once existed, where citations could really give you some sort of an indication of who was talking about your research and what they were saying about it. So this was a reaction to a situation. And Crossref was rather late to the game here. Talk about altmetrics had been going on for some time, and it wasn't clear exactly what we might be able to do in this sphere. But one thing that we did notice was that a lot of people seemed to be replicating each other's effort. That people were building tools, people were taking tools that others had built. So for instance, PLOS had built a tool that allowed you to collect information from lots of different sources about how DOIs are being used. And lots of publishers are deploying this and experimenting with it. And we thought, well, this is interesting. Clearly, Crossref, being concerned with the scholarly record and preserving the scholarly citation record in particular, should at least have a look at this and see what's going on. So we took some of the open source software that had been produced at PLOS, and we brought it to Crossref, and we actually loaded it up with a whole bunch of DOIs from Crossref, across publishers, to see if there was anything interesting that we could produce from this. And we did a blog post on it, as my group tends to do, saying that we'd launched this experiment, and we were interested in feedback from our members. And lo and behold, as I was sitting in a board meeting once, I got an email from Mark Patterson of eLife, and he said, wow, you know, we saw this posting of yours about this project that you've done where you've loaded up all these DOIs, and it happened to coincide with a conversation we were having at OASPA about the fact that almost all of our members were kind of doing the same thing, and that this seemed terribly inefficient, and that this also seemed, and I think this is critical, to make it a lot harder for people to do things like compare results and figure out whether people were actually coming to the same results based on the same data. And the final sentence is there anything that you think that you might be able to do to help at Crossref? Now, this was music to my ears, to our ears, because this is exactly kind of what Crossref does, which is it tries to help multiple parties in situations where negotiating bilateral agreements is just unscalable. And what I mean by that is this. When we think of the publishing community, often we think maybe each of us of a handful of publishers that we know, that we think are particularly good or particularly evil. And to us, that's our sort of scholarly ecosystem, you know? It's a handful. But if you actually look at the Crossref membership, the membership of Crossref is actually quite large. It was 4,000 members just a few years ago, and it's increased by up to 1,000 members just within the past year. We have 5,000, over 5,000 members. So if you're trying to negotiate bilateral agreements with them or get them to all do effectively the same thing and adopt the same kinds of standards and ways of collecting information and measuring it and reporting it, you've got a big, formidable task on your hands. And this actually gets worse because, again, this bilateral agreement or relationship isn't just one between publishers, but you have to factor in the combination of publishers with all of the different social media or other media outlets where the scholarly literature might be mentioned and discussed. And you start getting a very big problem, which is that you've got an awful lot of data being collected by an awful lot of different people in a lot of different ways. And from the point of view, again, of the OASPA people and to us, that could pose a problem because it might mean that we weren't able to compare this, that we weren't able to actually create standards of it. So we launched a pilot with this a working group made up both of the OASPA people who had contacted us first and a bunch of other publishers and third parties who were involved in the Altmetrics sphere. And we put together a project to see what it would take to actually collect the raw data that a lot of these metrics and tools were based on, and then redistribute it to the interested parties. And as we met in the initial days, we identified a number of concerns. One of the concerns was that there were an awful lot of parties doing this, right? And that there were a lot of parties that people in this space that were doing enhanced analysis. That is, they were providing reports, they were supplementing the material, they were contextualizing it, they were cleaning up the data, they were doing all of these things, but there was no pool of sort of common data that you could compare across those systems. But the common thing that a lot of these systems are doing is they're tracking DOIs, right? They're going out there and they're seeing if DOIs or things that should have DOIs are mentioned in any number of places. And then they're building those value-add services on that raw data. So we envisioned and piloted a system that would collect that raw data and put it in a central repository in a way that could be redistributed to third parties of any sort once it was collected in this central repository. And we spent about a year experimenting and building this pilot. We had scalability issues that we had to deal with. We had workflow issues that we had to deal with. But ultimately, what we came up with is a model where we think we can actually collect a lot of the data in a raw form, in a format that can be accessed by all the interested parties, and where they can build value-added services on top of them. And the technology behind this, while interesting, and I could go on about it for a long time, isn't actually the point. I think the point is that this data that's being collected will be open, comparable, auditable, and portable. And these, we think, are all things that are essential to producing proper standards for the use of that data and proper metrics that can actually be compared to each other. And it's based on a premise, and it's a fundamental premise of the project and of the pilot, which is that the value-added services of the analysis, of the normalizing, supplementing, and presenting that information, of the actual measurement, of the providing some sort of interpretation of that data, is a value-add service that's entirely separable from the raw collection of the data. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to end up in a situation that we've been in the past where this critical bit of information about the research process is locked up and nobody can look at it except for a handful of people who have collected this data independently. How am I doing on time? Great. And the great thing is that this DET pilot, which went on, as I said, for about a year, at the July board meeting was approved. We're going to be going ahead and turning this into a product over the next few months. And I think that one of the things that this is going to do is it's going to provide the industry with a new mechanism for dealing with standards. And this gets us back to the definition of standards. I kind of like the fact that under noun definition 2, you have standards, principles of conduct informed by notions of honor and decency. Now, in this sense of the word, standards is very important to us because in the past, we haven't thought a lot about the principles that underlie the infrastructure that we run and that's so critical to us as researchers. We have tended to focus on making data open, on making content open, but we haven't thought a lot about what it means if the infrastructure or if the data relating to the research process is locked up, what that's going to do to our industry. So what I'm proposing is that if we have altmetrics, one of the things that we need to think about is developing alt standards. And by alt standards, I mean principles. Principles for the collection of this data, for the treatment of this data. And I think the fundamental principle is that we have to accept that data about the research process, that is, data, metadata generated by researchers working with each other, using each other's work, no matter in what context, whether it's in the formal publications or whether it's in social media, has the same value as the data that underlies research. That we actually have to make this available if we're going to understand how researchers are interacting with each other, how the research process works. And this is one of the big things, I think, that the working group was working towards when they were thinking about building this set of open data. They wanted to make sure that if we build new metrics, if we build new tools for evaluating research and researchers and the research process, that the data underlying that is open, comparable, audible, and portable. Thank you very much. And I think this...
Yeah, it's time for a quick question if anybody has something they want to get off their chest now.
off their chest, except for those
No balls,
no
please.
ball throwing. Thanks.
Okay.
All right.
I think you've got off.
Excellent. Whew.
Yeah, I think Jeffrey feels you got off quite lightly there, so maybe you can get him at the coffee break later. So thank you very much, Jeffrey. And now, yeah, we're moving swiftly on. Our next speaker is Zoe Zahedi, who's a PhD in altmetrics researcher at the Centre for Science and Technology Studies in Leiden, so very local. And last year at the first Altmetrics conference, she, together with Rodrigo Costas and Martin Fenner, was awarded funding for a project on standards and altmetrics, and that's what she's going to be updating us on now. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very glad to be here to share with you some of the results of our project. And this project deals with the differences between altmetric data providers and aggregators, and what we wanted to know what are the differences and also what are the reasons for these differences. And yeah, as we did it together with Martin Fenner from the DataSat and Rodrigo Costas from Leiden University. And basically, this was funded by Thomson Reuters in the last Altmetric conference in London. And so with data provider, we mean the services which are the source of metrics. If the service calculate the metric itself, it's called data provider. And with data aggregator, we means the service which aggregate and offer the metrics. And this means that they don't recalculate the metrics themselves. And for this study, we used 3 services, one Mendeley.com and the other Altmetric.com, and also Lagato, which used by Plus. And how we extracted the metrics from them, we used, for readership data, we used Mendeley API, and for other metrics, we used the dump file from Altmetric.com, and also we used Lagato open source application to extract the metrics for our data set. And we decided to analyze the common sources across these different altmetric provider and aggregators. And in this study, in this presentation now, I only focus on the most interesting ones, which are Mendeley, Facebook, and Twitter. And for other sources like Reddit, Cytolike, and Wikipedia, we will put the more details in the paper. And with consistency, we mean having the same number as a source itself when a metric collected at the same time and date for the same set of DOIs. And the focus here is to know what are the consistency among these data providers, what are the differences if we collect the same metrics for the same data, for the same set of DOI when we control the date and time. And for example, if we want to compare Mendeley readerships, we wanted to know if the number is different reported by Altmetrics.com or reported by Lagato. And if they are different, what are the reasons? So with consistency, we mean exactly this. So a same document, a same DOI, have the same metrics across all data aggregator and providers. And out of these 5 services, we could only reach 3 of them, which is the Lagato, which used by Plus, and Mendeley.com and Altmetrics.com. But it was a pity that other Altmetric aggregators such as Plum Analytics and Impact Story couldn't participate in this study. And it was very difficult to reach all of these services, and we had some difficulties in agreeing on the random sample, on the size of the sample, and on the date and time to extract, the same date and time to extract the metrics from them. And for this study, we wanted to know how consistent, how are these different Altmetric provider and aggregators are consistent, and if there are any differences, what are the reasons for them. And we did the same study previous year, but it was, we used a smaller sample of random sample of only 1,000 plus 1 DOIs, which were published in 2013. And we did the same, this consistency analysis across these 3 Altmetric provider and aggregators. And the general results shows that they are not consistent, particularly regarding the Twitter and Facebook counts. But for this study, we expanded the previous one, and we used larger sets of DOIs, which include 30,000 DOIs, and we used cross-ref DOIs and also Web of Science DOIs, and which were published in the 2013. But our big problem here was also the publication date. So it wasn't clear what's the real publication date. Is it the publication date or is it the advanced publication date? So we have also some difficulties with this. For example, it may happen that a DOI has a publication year of 2013 in Web of Science, but 2015 in Crossref. And we controlled the date and time, and we did the data extraction from these 3 services at the same time on 23rd of July. And we started it at 2 o'clock, and it's not always 100% at the same time, because sometimes slow networks and other problems may influence the data extraction, but we control it. And the results shows that the coverage of these DOIs were more or less the same in Mendeley and Lagato, and both of these services had a coverage of this DOI about 70%, and Altmetrics.com covered only 20–30% of the DOIs. And we decided to analyze the common metrics for the overlapping DOIs, and the results shows that, for example, in terms of Lagato, it reports the highest number of Facebook counts and also slightly like and Reddit counts, but in terms of tweets, Altmetrics.com reported the highest tweets compared to other. And regarding the Mendeley readerships, we found that Lagato reported the same number as the sources as Mendeley, but Altmetrics.com was a little bit lower, which I will talk about the differences in the next slide. So in terms of consistency, comparing to the last study, we found that there are more consistent now, these 2 aggregators are more or less similar to each other, and the main reason is that that Mendeley API has improved a lot from the last year, and also the reasons for the differences, one of them is the frequency of update. For example, the Lagato updates of Mendeley readerships is by default is every day, but Altmetrics.com, in Altmetrics.com for readership data from Mendeley, there is always a time lag between the updates. And also the other problem is that, for example, in Altmetrics.com, they only report Mendeley readership for the documents that have at least one other metrics in other sources. For example, they discard a DOI with, for example, one Mendeley readership if it doesn't have any metrics in other sources. For example, if a DOI doesn't have Facebook accounts or tweets, but only one Mendeley readership, it doesn't considered by Altmetrics.com to report its readership. So that explains lower readership counts in Altmetrics.com compared to Lagato. And regarding the Facebook, we saw the same problem as last year. So they were very different across these two aggregators, and this may due to the different way of collecting the data and also the reporting their Facebook counts. For example, in Lagato, they aggregate Facebook counts, so they aggregate all Facebook shares, likes, posts, and comments. And but in Altmetrics.com, they only report Facebook public posts only. And also, regarding the way of collecting the Facebook counts, there are different as well. Lagato use Facebook API, but in Altmetrics.com they track links and then they resolve their links to papers. So this may show the differences across these different aggregators. And for Twitter accounts, we had the same result as last year. So both aggregators were very different. And again here, the main reasons for these differences are that the different APIs which these two aggregators use. For example, Lagato used the public API of Twitter, and there is a limitation there. For example, they can only collect a maximum 100 tweets per DOI, but on the other hand, Altmetrics.com use Genip, which is the only third party to get the Twitter data, and this explains the differences between these two services as well. And regarding the other sources, we saw, for example, for Reddit, we saw huge differences between these two data sources as well. And one of the reasons is that, for example, the Reddit counts reported by Lagato is the aggregate counts of posts and comments, while in Altmetrics.com it's only report the posts minus the comments. But I don't go to details for other sources now. So we did a study. So far we have identified some problems, which I'm going to summarize them here. And in order to know what are the different reasons for the inconsistency, we found that the methodology that different aggregators use for collecting the metrics influence the data and their metrics. And for example, and also on the other hand, how they report their metrics makes these differences. And also if, for example, they report the raw scores, or if they report the aggregated scores, makes these differences as well, which we should take into consider when we use these different systems. And for example, if they report the public post or private post or both of them, and also if they use different APIs, for example, if they use public API or commercial API as well. And sometimes there are some accessibility issues. For example, when they want to resolve using API, resolving the DOI, sometimes they require cookies and other things, so which is different across different publishers. And also the updating times between different between the source itself and the aggregators all influence the metrics that they report. So to sum, it shows that at this moment there is a need to have standards and guidelines, and both data providers and also publishers need to follow some standards and guidelines for their data, and it's really missing for Altmetrics at this moment. And I'm happy that NISO recently has initiated this Altmetrics Data Quality Working Group in order to develop code of conducts for Altmetrics data providers, and which can help to solve some of these problems. But although standards, developing standards for Altmetrics is very important and is needed here, we should also, the next step is that we should also think about the use of these metrics or misuse of these metrics. And then I will refer you to Leiden Manifesto as well. So if we have standards, it doesn't mean that all the problems have solved, but we should think about the use or misuse, and we should be aware of that problem as well. So I would like to thank you all, and if there is any question, I will be there for you.
Okay, if anyone has got any questions, we've got a microphone here.
Yes.
Hi Zora, my name is Hans Zijlstra. I have a question on, if I understand you correctly, it's basically a chaos in standard world for Altmetrics, right? Do you think that the general audience of researchers is aware of that?
Audiences, what do you mean? You mean researchers? So that's why this NISO group has formed in order to both aware people about the lack of standards when they want, for example, to use, and also aware the data providers and aggregators about this. That shows it's very necessary. Yeah.
So anyone else?
My name is Loet Leidensterk, Amsterdam. In addition to the normative issue of having standards, it means that in research we are not able to specify error, isn't it? Because these are all sources of error in data collection, which are not easy to control.
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
All this confusion leads to error in the data, which is difficult to specify.
You mean the data from the source itself?
Yeah, if you do an analysis, for example, an impact study.
Mm-hmm.
You
No. Sorry.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to respond or come up with a follow-up on that?
Yeah, I don't know if I would necessarily call it error. I think it's there's some very, I thought it's really interesting to see the reasons that Zora pulled out. But I think it's not so much that different people are doing it wrong. It's more that different people have different definitions of how we're doing it. And
oh, now I got it. So you meant error, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So we did a study to know how these aggregators report and collect the metrics, but regarding the data itself from the data sources, yes, you are right, from, for example, Mendeley. So we or other sources, we can see how do they do that. It's not that transparent. And that's why we need standards, and in order to develop this transparency, in order to know what's behind the scene, how do they collect their metrics and other things. Yeah.
So can you go a little bit into more detail what you mean by transparency in the data collection procedures? So for example, if Mendeley says there was a reader, what more information do you need in order to establish that, in fact, there was a reader? I mean, that's what is reported by Mendeley. So I just don't understand what you mean by more transparency from the underlying data sources. I can understand it from the aggregator's perspective, but not the underlying data sources.
So we have this definition in ISO Altmetrics Data Quality Working Group, and we are working on these definitions as well. So with transparency, we want to know exactly how each provider collects the data. And if we know, for example, we know that in terms of Mendeley readerships, if a user add a document to its own library, and then also it's increase it should increase the readership, or if it's deleted, it should be decreased. But yeah, so we don't know how to what are the frequency of the update and how do they deal with going up or going down. And yeah. Yes. And also, yeah. Also, when we have this, when we collect this data from aggregators, we don't know how these aggregators deal with these updating issues as well.
Okay, thank you, Zoe.
Okay.
Actually, I'd very much like to thank Zoe not only for a really interesting talk, but she also teed up our next speaker very nicely. Martin Fenner, until recently, was at PLOS, maybe you will know, but this August he changed direction, or in fact, progressed to become the technical director at DataSite. And he's also, in his spare time, chair of the steering group for the NISO Altmetrics project, and he's going to be reporting back to us on that.
Oh, so good.
Thank you for the introduction, and I will give an update on this project where I play a part in, but of course there are many people working on this project that is funded by the Sloan Foundation, and I listed some of them here. Of course, NISO staff is working on this. There are 3 working groups. Oh, there's Nettie. So I think Nettie, like us, would actually be standing here and talking, but her flight arrived, I think, just minutes ago. And maybe she's still a little jet-lagged. So I try to do my best to do this for her. We have 3 working groups with 6 co-chairs, and 5 of them should be in the room now. And we have about 50 people participated in these working groups, and that is probably a lot of people in this room as well. And just for background, this is a project that's going on for 2 years now. The first part was a white paper basically collecting all the issues around best practice and standards, and it was published last summer, fall, and I think it's still a good read because all of these issues, a lot of these issues are probably still relevant. And the second part of the project that started beginning of the year is forming 3 working groups to go into more detail, and I will be given an update on this. And these groups will be producing white papers that will be up for comment and will be finalized sort of in the first part of next year. And I will do this with one example, and you have to excuse me, this comes from the data world, which is here an example of a data set in Dryad by 2 people that many in the room know, Heather Peeblewar and Todd Vision. And so the first question when you think about Altmetrics is really, what's the use case? And this is one of many potential use cases. I'm interested in collecting metrics for data and how to do this in a standardized way, which is really where we are not right now. And that's sort of the first group. One of the tasks the group is working on is defining main use cases to identify what really the metrics are used for. And I think also in the flow of this presentation, that's really where you should start, not start collecting things and then later figure out what you can use these numbers for, but really think about the use cases. And the group has done a lot of hard work on this part. The second part that this group A is working on is what we're actually collecting and what we're calling this. This is the same data set now having 12 Mendeley readers, but it's really the question, what does reader mean? And is that something that's specific to Mendeley, or can you compare this to readers inside you like? And how do you define these things? And what is the difference between a reader and a citation? And how do you name all this, etc.? And that's sort of definitions of terms. And that's going on in parallel in this group, and there are some really basic issues this group is talking about, things like what is impact, what is open, and that's, of course, if you start that discussion, you're probably stuck in a room for the next 5 years. But the group is trying to find a sort of manageable way out of this. And it has drafted documents that they're sort of in the process of being polished to be ready to be sort of discussed in a wider audience in a few months. Another big issue is when you collect metrics, you need persistent identifiers. And we heard a lot about DOIs in the first talk, and this data set I use here as an example also as a DOI. But identifiers are important for other things as well. For example, identifiers for the 2 authors of this data set, in this case ORCID, so that you can link all these things together for your metrics. And you might want identifiers for grants and funders, for institutions, etc., because then only then it becomes possible to say this is really the research funded by funder X, and these are the metrics associated with that. And that's, for the most part, is an unsolved problem. And in the context of metrics, this group B, again, the 2 chairs are in the room, Christy here, Mike somewhere, if he has arrived yet from his plane flight. What persistent file identifiers are needed for metrics and what works needs to be done there. And the other question that group B works on, and again, this example is a good one, is if you collect metrics for data, in this case, downloads, how exactly do you do that? And are the metrics maybe different if you look at data than if you look at journal articles? So is downloads the same thing? You should use the same standards, or you need something else? And data is just the most obvious example of things that we have to worry about, but just the idea that what are specific metrics for specific output types. And Group B has organized a webinar which will take place in about a month, and it's a free webinar that's organized by Fiona, so you can ask her in the coffee break. And this is basically inviting several groups that work on metrics for data, both in standards and implementation, and bring everybody together and give an overview where we are. So initiatives like RDA, Force 11, Counter, etc. And the last group is basically working on what Zora just described, and Zora is of course also in that working group, which is data quality issues. And this is a slide from the smaller study we did last year. And basically this group is working on strategies to improve data quality. What this group has done so far, and is sort of in the process of finishing, is a proposed code of conduct to provide clear guidelines how to collect, process, disseminate, and reuse data. And if that sounds in any way similar to the last slide that Jeff presented, that's probably not a coincidence, even though this group came there on independent paths, but that it really all starts with collecting the data. If that's sort of done differently or in ways that are difficult to follow, then everything you do with these data is really sort of tempered, and that we discussed this in the previous presentation. And lastly, and I try to sort of rush up a little bit because we were running late and the presentation before was much more important. The timeline for these working groups is that they probably started in the spring after sort of getting started, did a lot of work just collecting information that's out there, started to write it together, discuss how to do these things, and now all 3 groups are in the process of sort of finalizing draft documents in the next few months, so that something can be presented early next year, sort of for public comment, because it shouldn't be that standards or best practices are just generated by groups of people meeting in phone conference and nobody else is sort of involved. And it's sort of a common ISO practice to open this up for comment, and then later in 2016 in the spring, these outputs from these groups will be finalized. And NISO is a standards organization, but of course there are all kinds of different outputs. So not everything has to become a standard, but there's best practices and just different kinds of things they can do, from reporting the current status quo to giving recommendations like the code of conduct, the definitions, etc. So I think it's all on its way, and if there's a 3M, these things should be done, but hopefully much sooner, in the sort of first half of next year. Thank you very much.
So, are there any questions for Martin? Yeah, I've got a couple of minutes. Oh, you must have just covered the whole thing just beautifully. Okay, so thank you very much, Martin. And now we have our, I'll do it this way. We have our final speaker in this session, which is Greg Gordon, who's the co-founder, the president and the CEO of the Social Sciences Research Network. And he'll be speaking about data quality in a moment when we've got the his slides hooked up.
I just arrived about an hour ago, so I did not get the slides to Martin on time, so I'm that guy today. I'll break it. If I don't drop this will be amazing. All right, let's start here with the first slide. Okay, so apologize for any jet lag. And is this on? Yes. 1 2 1 2. All right. Technology's not my friend here. Okay, so like I said, I'll apologize for any jet lag in the beginning, but I did pick the right flight because Nettie and Mike chose a flight out of Philadelphia, and I chose one out of Atlanta, so mine didn't get delayed, so I actually made it here on time. What we've been talking about, just started with standards and metrics, and we talked about consistency, and we talked about some of the things that are going on at NISO, and what I want to talk about is actually something that we've done, right? I mean, it's kind of fun to talk about all these things in a global perspective. But what we did was, a few of us, Jennifer, Richard, Ralph, and myself, we actually wrote a paper about what we're doing at SSRN and have been done at PLOS about data integrity. So what we're really talking about, though, is the need for consistency, not across sources, but consistency where maybe people are inconsistently challenging our data. Maybe where they're kind of cheating a little bit to improve their rankings or to have metrics that they can then tout for some other purpose. So what we thought about when we started putting this paper together, what is the motivation behind these activities? And we spent a bit of time at SSRN thinking about motivation, and so we've looked at, from the University of Rochester, some of this stuff called self-determination theory. If you're a Dan Pink fan, he calls it autonomy, mastery, and purpose. But really what we're talking about is why people do the things that they do and what's the kind of cause behind that. So when you start to rank anything, you're going to have some people that start to cheat because those rankings start to have value, and they feel that the higher up the ranking they are, the better off they appear, either professionally, personally, or just to themselves. So anytime you start to have numbers, you have to be concerned not just about the consistency across the source, but also the validation and the validity of the numbers themselves. And so that's what we started to talk about. we started to look at this paper, we started to look at some things that have occurred. And here's a piece from Science way back in 1999, you know, the dark ages of electronic publishing. And what they talk about here is that success is rewarded with attention. So that the things that people do to write papers is often rewarded with downloads. It's rewarded with citations. It's rewarded with tweets. It's rewarded with these things that we're calling metrics. In SSRN, we actually had a paper a couple of years ago. And the interesting thing about this paper is that they actually, using this time trade-off method, which is an actual decision-making methodology for health care, they actually did the analysis on some economists and whether or not they were, how much they wanted to be, how much they were motivated to be published in the American Economic Review, one of the top economics journals. And they actually said that most of these economists would give up half of a thumb to be published in AER. So cheating is actually pretty simple if you're going to give up half a thumb to be published in AER. So let me dial it back just a little bit and talk about SSRN, just to give, if you don't know SSRN. So we're the largest repository in the social sciences and humanities. The most important thing here is this last item. We level the playing field. We strongly support open access. Anybody can submit for free. Anybody can download that content for free. So we have a lot of people giving us a lot of content and a lot of usage. So we have about 300,000 authors. We get about another 2,300 new authors every single month. We have about 600,000 papers. We get about 65 to 70,000 new submissions every month. So a lot of content in, a lot of content from a lot of different people. We deliver about 1 million PDFs a month. And this is the way to think about SSRN. We try to let 1,000 flowers bloom. So it doesn't matter if you're at the University of Amsterdam or Harvard or Monroe Community College in Rochester, New York. If you have an idea, we want that idea. We want the community to be able to help us find new ideas, to help share those ideas. My simple definition of innovation is to create something new from an existing set of other things. And so at SSRN, we try to be the broadest, deepest set of existing things that there are so people can create cool new research faster and more efficiently. Now, when you have a lot of things and you have a lot of people, you run into problems like information overabundance. So SSRN, for probably close to about 18 years now, has been tracking downloads and reporting them on a paper basis and then ranking basis. So here you start to see some of the downloads. One of the other methodologies that we use are citations, because citations are very, very important. So whereas downloads kind of give you a view of something that's current, citations are another type of a metric. It does a different thing. It shows you who is actually using this information in their research. And then we work with Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West on eigenfactor. And you know, if you don't know eigenfactor, basically it's this mathematical round robin to look at all of the different items that are influenced, the different nodes within the network as opposed to the traditional journal impact factor. I was in China a couple weeks ago and gave a talk on measuring impact. And it's kind of interesting if you've ever been to China. They really don't care about anything other than impact factor. Really don't care about anything other than impact factor. So I tried to give them this really helpful understanding of what was going on and basically spent most of the time answering every single question I could about impact factor, which quite honestly is one of the few things that I don't like to talk about. So I actually stole this slide from Alberto Pepe. And it was kind of the way that I couched this, and it's kind of the way that I want us maybe to be thinking about metrics and gaming a little bit, and the data integrity. And so Alberto basically says that, you know, we're doing this new 21st century research with 20th century tools packaged in 17th century format. And so when I start to think about journal impact factor, it's kind of a good, valuable measure, but it's really not the current way to be thinking about things, right? So we're talking about a broader set of things. Now, as much as I think we all know this, I just want to make sure that we're clear. There's a difference between altmetrics and article level metrics. And so what we're talking about in the paper is article level metrics, what gets counted at the individual article level. And there's a ton of different metrics out there. So there's SNP, and there's SJR, and my favorite one of all time, just because of the cool name, is snowball metrics. And so this consistency across these data sources, this consistency of not having good quality data, this gaming, all of these factors start to roll into this thing that we simply call trust. And at the end of the day, if you can't trust the numbers, they have virtually no value. So when we started to put together this paper, it wasn't to try to say we should trust SSRN or we should trust PLOS, but it was basically because we didn't have the standards that we've been talking about already this morning, and we felt it was important to put a stake in the ground to say, here's what we're doing. It creates a little bit of a queer or perverse set of incentives, though. Right? How far down that road do we go? If we tell you exactly how we're measuring fraudulent downloads, we effectively give you the keys to the kingdom to fraudulently download. So from a gaming perspective, it's kind of like spam, right? It's this cat and mouse of how do we do this? How do we tell how much do we tell about it? Where do we start to draw the line? There's just a few papers that are in the SSRN system where they're actually using our downloads for other types of measurement. So we think it's very, very important. But what we want to be sure is that we don't wind up in this problem of mobocracy where basically everybody starts to chase numbers and we wind up in this out-of-control system where people are putting together things and aggregating numbers that should not be aggregated. It's very easy to point, to Google Scholar and say that things are bad, but there's a lot of other places where things are bad. And here's some of the stuff that's going on at Archive, right, where people are cheating the numbers at Archive. And oh my gosh, actually over at SSRN too. So we worked with Ben and Ian at Harvard Business School, and what they did was they looked at this broad spectrum of what we consider to be fraudulent downloads. They did an in-depth analysis of who those authors were, and came back with some very interesting data as it relates to, based on where you are in your career path, who in your cohort is actually popular or not popular. All right, I'll share it. So men cheat more than women. Hard for many of you to believe, right? And other factors that start to happen is based on where you are relative to your peers. So it's not just am I getting ahead of my career, but it's basically if you're in a department where somebody else has more downloads than you, you are more likely to cheat. So a lot of these things get discussed in the paper, and you can certainly read the paper, but a couple of important things start to come out of it. What we've attempted to do is share the way that we look at things so that people, before the standards are introduced, can learn, and hopefully we can start to get cleaner data across the spectrum. Very high level, PLOS takes a, let's look at the data that is produced from the download, do some analysis across PMC and some other sources to say this looks inconsistent, and then adjust for those factors. SSRN does it on the front end. So we look at where people are coming from, how many downloads, and some tracking in that side of it. So what you see here is we actually have more downloads that we don't count than we do count. So last year we had about 12 million downloads, and I think we had just over 25. 12 million downloads that we reported. We had about 25 million downloads in total. So the thing that's important is that we're not about trying to have a big number for downloads. We're actually about having a number that matters. So we created this system, and I did black out the right columns, good. But we created this system where we actually have a very complex methodology for tracking who's downloaded what over what period of time. And it still is amazing to me that really smart people don't realize that when you download your paper from your IP address at your university, only once, one paper, or each of your papers once, morning, noon, and night, for every day that school is in session, that it doesn't create a pattern that people would identify quite easily. So still not exactly sure how that one works out. But what we also tried to think of, and this is actually a 3D printer program result where they have connections between most of the kids' toys. So you'll see Lego and Duplo and K'NEX, and for those of you who actually had the pleasure of playing with them as a child, some Lincoln Log items also. So what these are is this is actually a program that you can put into your 3D printer and print out all of these pieces to connect all of the different toys that you had as a child in ways that were never ever possible. So when we think about metrics and we think about the importance of it, we start to think about them being connections in ways that aren't possible before we started to create them. And what we said in the paper is that we're looking for a broader view of what's required for trust and engagement, or in engaging the entire community to consider their role. So I hope you take a look at the paper, and I hope you understand that what we're doing at PLOS and SSRN is sharing stuff that is very, very intimate to us and very important to us in an effort to start to move the conversation forward. Because we think that the standards are important, but they're going to take a little while to come, and we want to get the data as accurate and clean as possible. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Greg. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Given that we're running really remarkably fitly on time.
Hi, Marie McVeigh. How do you balance the need for transparency and all of the discussion of transparency about how numbers are generated, and the need not to be transparent so that you're basically not giving the playbook to gamers?
It's arguably impossible, right? And
transparency without accountability.
yeah, one of the things we talk about in the in the paper is that within SSRN, what we found was that we had about a 70% decrease in fraudulent downloads the moment that we popped up a warning screen that people were identified. What we find is that we're not giving away TVs or iPhones, right? I mean, these are downloads, so it's not quite have the market value of some other things. But the reputational cost to people who are identified can be so massive. If you think that an SSRN or PLOS download is going to help you career-wise, the potential for being identified as a cheater has such massive reputational costs that it offsets that. So it just is amazing to us that we put up, and it's in the paper, we put up a warning message, and that dropped, I think, 3/4 of the fraudulent activity went down immediately just by flashing that warning method. So then you wind up with 25 million data points per year within SSRN and more at PLOS, you start to see some patterns that identify things at a fairly granular level. So no, we wouldn't share every single thing that there is, but you start to see some interesting aspects, and so that's part of what the paper brings out is just some basic things that everybody can do.
Any other questions?
Greg, you were briefly talking about China purely focusing on the impact factor. What were the main reactions you got when you tried to convince them of other options they had?
It was kind of interesting because they, it was an STM cast meeting, and so it was a room full of publishers and top scholars, and I, to be honest with you, it was probably one of the worst talks I've ever given, because I was trying to share this, I was trying to open up a mindset, and the mindset was literally, if it's not impact factor, it really does not matter. And there's all kinds of, most of you are well aware that, there's all kinds of financial motivation and, hierarchy and promotion and those kind of things. But they are so closely tied to impact factor that the conversation was basically, well, how do I get an impact factor? And I just don't care about the rest of this stuff. And you know, I've spent a fair bit of time in Asia over the last few years, and you know, I liken it to that, you know, that kind of prairie dog, right? How do I, you know, if I've got 1 billion people here, how do I pop my head up and show it? And right now, impact factor is the driver. And so, you know, I shared a lot of the information about, you know, different metrics and why they're valuable and what they show, and it was you know, deaf ears. It was almost entirely, you know, how do I get an impact factor, and why would you, you know, why would you, silly American, think about anything else?
Sorry, from NUI Galway, Ireland. The funding agencies only value the impact factor for measuring, awarding grants.
Well, there's some, I mean, just Google it. I mean, I haven't looked recently, but you know, there are rewards, for lack of a better term. You know, if you get published in a top, if you're in Nature or Science, you can get a $30,000 or $50,000 US check, equivalent of that, as a bonus for just getting a paper published in there. So I mean, just massive amounts of cash being thrown at those top journals. So it's not just funding agencies, you know, it's the funding, it's the university, it's the government. It happens at many levels.
Okay. Well done if we run out of questions. But
So can you talk a little bit more about your feelings around context of use? It seems like you put up this banner and you said, hey, this can be hazardous to your reputation. Do you think Altmetrics then is useful at the aggregate level or these individual reporting levels? Yeah, can you talk a bit about that context of use?
It's actually a great question, and you know, my personal view is that, and the reason that, you know, that I'm spending a lot of time in this community is I think that it has massive amount of possibility, a significant amount of overhype, and we don't know exactly how it is best used. You know, I think that there are a number of things that can be indicators for activities. I think there are a number of things that are thought to be indicators of activities or value, and I don't think that we're there yet. You know, I think that the landscape needs to be much broader, and we need to have standards for what's the data. We need to have consistency across the different data providers. And then we need to, you know, have this back-end challenge of how we're using it. I find it very interesting that, you know, what used to be this kind of small community of who's aggregating this information and what are we learning from it has now become far more corporate, right? You know, most of these companies have become part of a bigger entity, which I certainly understand, right? I mean, resources are very difficult. And people are trying to do massive projects with very little money. So I just find it interesting that it's not quite this little startup community anymore. You know, plums inside of EBSCO, et cetera, et cetera. And so you wind up with a lot of knowledge being cloistered in companies inside of big corporations. So I'm a little bit afraid that we're not going to get all of the benefits as if it was all open, because there's commercial reasons behind it. But I think that if we get some standards, that there's opportunities. But I think we're ways away.
yeah, thank you, Greg. Is there anybody else that, yeah?
Hi, this is Daniel Petrario from Frontiers. My question would be, you mentioning that it goes a bit in the corporate direction. How is it with SSRN? Are you sharing the statistics? Is it possible to get access to downloads and views numbers?
Every single item that we have, has its own abstract page, and the views and the downloads are right there.
Is it also available via APIs or anything that could be integrated, for instance, in the...
We don't have an API for it currently. Just, you know, it's just on the priority stack. It just hasn't made its way to the top. But
Okay.
I mean, certainly people can scrape them.
All right, so your
Quite
terms
easily.
and conditions allow scraping this type of data as an example.
Sure.
All right, thank you.
Okay. I think we should let you go, shouldn't we? Because you've just sat on a plane and you've come straight here and you've spoken, you know, very cogently. So thank you very much, Greg. But can I just? I just wanted to say thank you again to all the speakers for being so sort of interesting and informative, and also for interweaving their various topics so well. I think making it very kind of coherent session. Thank you. Yes, the coffee break is from now until 20 past 11. So given that we're all being very, very prompt, you've got 5 minutes extra here, I think you owe it to the next set of speakers to be on time.